Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our look at Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, switching to domestic policy and laying out how he became known as the Bull Moose, and how he really transformed the Republican Party into a party of progressivism and change from its previous status as supporting big business and the status quo. So here he is riding the Republican elephant through all of the scandals and bribery of the Gilded Age and really ushering in the progressive era. So let's talk about the Bull Moose. Here are our objectives for today. So let's dive in. We've got a lot to talk about today, so let's get going. Progressivism is a movement that emerged in the late Gilded Age. It's somewhat related to populism in that it was pushing for reform as opposed to the status quo. But the whole point of progressivism was to try to look critically at society's problems, and then once they were exposed by muckrakers, come up with sort of reasonable, logical, scientific solutions to them. With the idea that, when humans get together and put their ingenuity towards problems, they can come up with reasonable solutions and usher in a better world. And so it's sort of connected with the social gospel, sort of connected with reform movements we've seen in the past, sort of connected to the rise of mass media and all these other things, and definitely a response to all the stuff we talked about in the late Gilded Age. Up until this point, most of the progressives had been muckrakers and pushing for reform. There had been pretty limited success for most of these progressives because the entrenched interests were not super obviously on board with changing the status quo. And so the temperance movement, conservation movements, women's rights movements, the labor movement, all of them ran into the immovable object that was the infinity dollars that the monopolists had to spend on lobbying and stuff like that. And so, really, the ascension of Theodore Roosevelt after the election of 1900, which, as we talked about last time, was really incidental. Theodore was shoved into the vice presidency because the Republican establishment wanted to get rid of him and were worried about what he would do as governor of New York. And so, offering him the vice presidency was a chance to put him into a totally useless position where he'd have no political power, except when McKinley was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz. Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore, ascended to the presidency and now could push reform and his vision of society. As we talked about previously, Theodore was a vigorous reformer. He was an outdoorsman. He had been a cowboy. He'd been a soldier. We've got this iconic picture of Theodore. He's a very larger-than-life individual, and he was not opposed to moving in and trying to solve society's problems. He embraced this model of progressivism and really embraced a life of sort of vigorous action, and in the same way that Andrew Jackson became the people's president and this sort of icon for change and reforming the American political process, Theodore Roosevelt really ushered in this era of progressivism and kicked off the age of the progressives. Here's an account of Roosevelt as police commissioner. So take a moment, pause, see the comparisons between Jackson and Roosevelt, and let's move on. Theodore Roosevelt used this once referred to the presidency as a, quote, bully pulpit. And Theodore Roosevelt really understood that the age of mass media provided opportunities for politicians that had never happened before. And so Theodore Roosevelt would use the press and used the presidency as a way to draw attention to issues, as a massive megaphone to point at things that he thought were important, and to really drive the public conversation about these issues. He would go and give speeches directly to the public, the same way William Jennings Bryan would, famously connecting with the public in these speeches. My favorite Theodore Roosevelt story, of course, is the Bull Moose story, where Theodore, when running for president in 1912, this is obviously a different story that we'll get to later. When running for president, an assassin came up and shot him in the chest. This was the age again of anarchist assassins trying to kill world leaders. Theodore Roosevelt famously said, "It'll take more than that to stop a bull moose," and then got up and gave a 3-hour speech before going to the hospital. It turned out the size of the speech in his breast pocket had slowed down the bullet, and so this helped build the mythology of Theodore Roosevelt and his nickname, the Bull Moose. Theodore Roosevelt also started what's called the daily press briefing, giving direct quotes to newspaper writers and newspaper editors and reporters, and making sure that his words were getting directly to the public. Through this, Theodore was able to sort of build a larger constituency and really take control over some of the more reticent members of his party. He could push senatorial agendas by giving interviews to people, and he really mastered this form of modern mass media in a way that allowed him to drive the political conversation in a way that no president ever had before. And so this gave significant power to the president to set the legislative agenda and moved his and significantly increased his influence. Here we see Samuel Gompers, the famous labor leader, laying out sort of his vision of Theodore Roosevelt. So take a moment, pause, and we'll move forward. And Theodore Roosevelt decided that all of these Gilded Age laws that were on the books that hadn't been enforced would now be enforced. For example, he's going to actually use the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and much like Grover Cleveland, appoint people not based on political ideology, but based on their capacity, their capability, their honesty, things like that. But most importantly, he's going to bring back the Sherman Antitrust Act and start using it as a metaphorical big stick to knock down monopolies and to get concessions out of big businessmen. This is Theodore's famous showdown with J.P. Morgan over his breaking up of the Northern Securities Company. Take a moment and read this and then contrast it to what we've seen from the Sherman Antitrust Act in the past. And so by taking on J.P. Morgan and breaking up the Northern Securities Company, Theodore Roosevelt actually effectively used the Sherman Antitrust Act. He took on the monopolists and was seen as a hero of the common people, really building again a cult of personality around himself. And so despite the fact that he didn't make any friends with the business community, nor the Republican establishment, he was spectacularly popular with the people, seen as, again, a champion standing up for the little guy. We saw this idea of fairness in the anthracite coal strike. There was a threatened coal strike in 1904. And so Theodore Roosevelt, of course, concerned that a shortage of fuel going into the winter could lead to a massive increase in prices and problems for consumers. And so Theodore did what Theodore does. Take a moment and pause. Here's his accounts of dealing with the '02 anthracite coal strike. Apologies, I had said '04 earlier. It was 1902. And so Theodore first made sure to get the workers back to work by threatening them with the Sherman Antitrust Act. But then he used the exact same Sherman Antitrust Act to threaten the monopolists in order to get some concessions for the workers. And so he sat down, forced arbitration, forced a fair deal between the two sides, and made sure that coal prices stayed low for the winter, making himself, again, not really any friends amongst labor unions and not any friends amongst coal mine owners, but friends amongst the common people. Theodore also attempted, or at least wanted, to sit down and deal with this problem of civil rights. He invited civil rights icon Booker T. Washington to sit down with him for dinner at the White House and discuss issues. This was the first time that the president had actually sat down and dined with a non-white person. And as you can see here, they're really trying to play on the legacy of Lincoln. Unfortunately, backlash amongst racists within both parties led Theodore to be unable to find an actual compromise, but it's a baby step forward, maybe, kind of. Yeah. And so in the election of 1904, Theodore is going to run on a policy called the Square Deal, providing equal protection for laborers, regulating big business, protections for the environment, and protections for consumers. There was some sense that opposition from the trusts might prevent Theodore from being able to win the presidency. But again, Theodore is a spectacularly popular president who's able to build a popular mythology around himself in order to help build support. For example, the story of the teddy bear. So the story of the teddy bear is Theodore was on a campaign trip down to Mississippi where he went out hunting for bears. After a long hunting trip, Theodore was very disappointed that he didn't find any bears to shoot. But as he was sitting down to dinner, one of his aides came to him and said, Mr. Roosevelt, we found a bear." So Theodore went out into the woods and found a scrawny bear that had been tied to a tree. Seeing this pathetic animal, Theodore took mercy upon it and declined to shoot the bear. Instead, he had one of his party go and club the bear to death and then ate it for dinner. This inspiring story led to toy manufacturers cordoning on to this idea and led to the creation of Teddy's Bears, a popular children's toy that has become almost ubiquitous in American society. So that's the story of the teddy bear, and also the story of Theodore Roosevelt connecting with viewers. And so, in the end, take a moment and pause and read about Theodore Roosevelt, but he's going to become bigger in the eyes of the public than the party establishment, or big business, or any particular interests. So, pause. And your result is this. All the states that aren't voting against Abraham Lincoln overwhelmingly support Theodore Roosevelt, giving him a large majority in the popular vote and a stunning electoral victory for someone who would not have been nominated and certainly could not have won in 1900. And so Theodore's vigorous use of the presidency is going to open the door for reform. Theodore is going to continue squeezing the trusts, using the Sherman Antitrust Act as a metaphorical club by taking down trusts that he sees as acting inappropriately, while providing restraint for good trusts. This builds, of course, lots of popularity for Theodore amongst the common people, as he's seen as sort of a champion standing up for the little guy. And it allows him to make sure that monopolists like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and JP Morgan don't get too out of hand. He passes, or the Republicans pass, a new law called the Hepburn Bill, which helps regulate railroad rates and provides more specifics to the Interstate Commerce Act. So here's Theodore bringing his big stick to regulate the railroads. In this cartoon, Theodore is shown as adopting democratic principles because railroad regulation was part of the populist platform. And so for Theodore, it doesn't really matter to him whether it's a traditional Republican or a Democratic issue. If he sees it as a problem, he's going to pass laws to attempt to do this. So here's Theodore, again, riding busting the railroad bronco, metaphorically. Here he is taking on, again, the Wall Street giants and JP Morgan and the other monopolists, and building massive support. The other place, or two of the other places that Theodore pushed reform was one, a book called The Jungle came out, which, again, take a moment and pause and read this. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was a muckraking novel that was supposed to reveal unsanitary working conditions within the meatpacking industry in Chicago. But in reality, what people took away from it was that the meat was incredibly gross. The conditions in these plants meant that unsanitary meat and rotten meat was being served to the public on a regular basis. And maybe we needed to actually regulate some of this stuff. And so the government passed a combination of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, the sort of precursors to the FDA, to start making sure that the medicine that was actually in medicine was really medicine, that the things in products were clearly labeled, and that conditions in meatpacking plants were much more sanitary. So the end result of this is, unfortunately, no more cocaine tooth drops, no more cocaine in Coca-Cola, no more dubious cancer cures, and no more rotten meat ground up with rats and humans and served to the public. The last piece for Theodore Roosevelt was conservation. So take a moment, read this piece, and we'll move on. Theodore was a noted outdoorsman who wanted to set aside large parts of natural landscape in order to be preserved. And so the New Lands Act set aside land to not be developed and set aside a lot of the lands that would eventually be codified into the national park system. This was one of the first times, with the exception of Yellowstone Park, where the federal government began to set aside lots of land in order to not develop it and to keep it pristine for future generations. And it's really the beginning, or it's where the conservation movement in America really starts to pick up steam. So that's the other part of Theodore's square deal. In the end, at the end of Theodore's term, we have an economic panic, partially because of another run on banks. We get another speculative crisis. You don't really need to, the lack of a standard national bank was becoming a problem. And so this is a global financial crisis that eventually cascaded into the United States. But yet again, JP Morgan found some change in his couch, helped bail out some banks and the US government, and this did not become a massive depression. So Theodore Roosevelt's legacy, he's not going to run for a third term because, Washington. Despite the fact that he wasn't elected for his first term, he served the majority of it. Instead, he's going to go on a safari to Africa, where he's going to single-handedly try to depopulate the continent of large animals. and he's going to try to hand off his legacy to his handpicked successor, another progressive, a guy named William Taft. So we'll let Theodore ride off into the sunset and try to kill as many elephants as possible. And for next time, we'll look at Taft and Woodrow Wilson and the way in which they codified and formalized this growth of progressivism within the United States. So Theodore is not gone from our story, but he is on temporary vacation, and we'll pick up our narrative tomorrow with the other progressives. Thank you for listening.